engagement here at the Whitney. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's program, Photographic Activities, a Salon, which brings together 6 artists in the 2019 Whitney Biennial who work with the medium and activity of photography. We were supposed to have 7, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Heji Shin was unable to be here today. I want to start by thanking my colleagues Jane Panetta and Rujaku Hockley, co-curators of the 2019 Whitney Biennial. Thank you. You have brought together such an amazing group of artists, and we are thrilled to be featuring so many of their voices in the programming for the show. So that's a way for me to plug that we have a lot more programming coming up this summer. But as for today's program, hopefully many of you have had a chance to see the Biennial already. And if you have, then you most likely noticed that none of today's speakers have their work in the same gallery in the exhibition. Their art has been put in dialogue with artists working in other media, from painting and sculpture to video and installation. So while photographic practice isn't necessarily a theme in the Biennial itself, it does include this incredible group of artists who are deeply engaged with photography, exploring and expanding on its very multiplicity. They work with genres and traditions including documentary, studio portraiture, formalism, and the investigations of the technical apparatus. It is perhaps a cliche of the history of photography to point out that it has no single origin story and that there is no one definition of what constitutes a photograph, a condition that seems to have only been exacerbated by the digital age. It is also a fairly recent development that the very heterogeneity of the medium has started to be embraced as part of its aesthetic potential, which is why it's so exciting to bring this group of artists together to share their thoughts and to ask each other questions. So it's truly an honor to have Lucas Blalock, Edmunds, Todd Gray, Curran Hatleberg, Elle Pérez, and Mpagi Sepuya here today. Thank you all so much for your work and for making time for this conversation. I'm going to forego reading everyone's bio because you're going to hear from each artist directly. Following their short presentations, they will join each other on stage for a conversation, and then we will hopefully have some time at the end for audience questions. So given that there are 6 of them, I'm gonna, that's all I wanna say. And thank you all so much for being here. And they're gonna speak in alphabetical order, so I'm gonna invite Lucas to come up to the podium to kick it off.
Okay, cool, thank you. So this is a kind of nutshell, I feel like, of what I normally kind of say about my work, but I think that really where I come from is a relationship to 2 kind of readily knowable terms, one of which is photography, and the other of which is this kind of certain strata of sort of American consumerist objects. And I've kind of used these 2 readily knowable things to kind of to look for space between them, or to look for invention or intervention, or the kinds of sort of unexpected territory that something you know so well has sort of hidden within it. So this is a picture called Ducks from 2014. And this comes from a few steps back in my practice when I was really thinking a lot about a photography that was really only sort of digitally edited professionally. This is kind of before the moment of the photo app and the iPhone and the way that it is now. And I was thinking about sort of using these procedural steps that commercial photographers went through in making their photographs and using those in a kind of ham-fisted way, or kind of creating a new set of relationships, or a new tension between the sort of digital space and this analog material space I was photographing. And then the other 3 I've included here are all pictures that are in the show upstairs in different ways. So still thinking about this kind of everyday object. But now, you know, when I started, I was saying that the only people using Photoshop were kind of professionals, you know, as like professional artists or people who made commercial photographs. And as time has gone on, these kind of post-production tools have gotten in everyone's hands. So I went from thinking about a photograph as a kind of fixed proposition, a thing that had very kind of like good boundaries and real expectations around it, to a much more plastic kind of idea of a picture of the world. And so I'm still interested in a lot of the same kinds of things, but the sort of vocabulary inside of the work has expanded. So this is a picture called Some Eggs. So in this same set of ideas, I've been thinking a lot about the way that our world is kind of, I don't know, that there's a kind of cohabitation of virtual space and material space. And this is both in photographs at this point, but also in our daily lives, you know? Like the phone space and our sort of material room space are always kind of competing with each other. And so I started thinking about these ways that there was this interpenetration, and thinking about trying to picture virtual situations or virtual spaces sort of in and among physical spaces. And one of the things I sort of looked back to think about this was in the early 20th century, there were these kind of amazing photographs of ghosts made by spiritualist photographers who were thinking about a different kind of virtuality that was inhabiting their material world. And so this is sort of like nesting virtual spaces, I guess. So this is the billboard on the south side of Gansdenbourg Street right now. And this is a project I did specifically for this site. And it's a project that also includes an augmented reality component. So there's an app called Donkey Business that you can download and then have kind of sculptural cinematic experiences with this image. The app reads the image and then sort of produces a sort of digital reality that lays on top of the physical space. And I think that this is sort of a new thing for me. Augmented reality is kind of new for me, and it's something maybe we'll talk about later. But it's also, this was an opportunity for me, I thought, to kind of create an allegorical picture and think about this kind of very flat photographic donkey on the left-hand side of the image, and this kind of deflated, material, but kind of, cheap sort of rubber donkey in the center is the blue shape in the middle. And then this kind of, this 3D donkey, which took all of this flattening that had been done to these other two and kind of re-expanded it, but in a kind of digital zombie way. And so thinking about this as a kind of technological allegory, as well as an allegory in other ways. So I think that's it. But yeah, thank you very much.
Hi, how are you guys? So I'm just going to talk briefly about each slide. My name is John Edmunds, and I am a photographer and an artist based in Brooklyn, New York. I've been, in my most recent work, I'm using studio cameras, a 4x5 camera, Hasselblad, to explore the relationship of the black body to studio photography, more specifically thinking about these different kind of artistic movements in which African art and African sculpture influence the proliferation of modernism. So I'll just go through a few of the slides. This picture in particular is called Status. There is a black gay poet by the name of Essex Hemphill who has a poem entitled, "If I Simply Wanted Status, I'd Wear Calvin Klein." So a lot of the pictures kind of reference also kind of different influences within kind of black queer literature. So this image is entitled The Villain. So kind of thinking about the relationship of the red bandana and this idea of potential threat, and remixing it with these kind of Bantu knots, very kind of African hairstyle. But in a lot of my pictures, I think about the relationship of the evolution of Black style. So in many of the pictures are about a kind of self-making. This is Untitled Head 1. So the previous pictures that you guys just saw are pictures that are currently in the Whitney Biennial. But, in many of my pictures, try to really kind of flirt with this idea of sculpture through the act of photography and kind of heightened description of the way that the subject or the texture of what's in the photograph actually feels. More recently, this is an installation view of a current show that I have up right now at Company Gallery. And this show is entitled Between Pathos and Seduction, which is also a poem by Essex and Phil. He has a book called Ceremonies that is a collection of poetry and prose. And the poem Between Pathos and Seduction, I think, really kind of highlights the way that, in many ways, it highlights this idea of entanglement, but also the way in which Black people have continued to move and kind of oscillate throughout the world. So it's a photograph of my friend and my art collection called Anatolian Collection. And this is the last slide, female nude. So a lot of my pictures also think about this idea of art history and kind of reframing art history. I often collect objects, sculptures, these kobo cloths that are, sorry, Todd. These kobo cloths that are, that I recently collected from from the Baldwin Fashion Institute in Philadelphia. So for me, the pictures are kind of representative of this kind of journey of kind of bringing these different kind of materials, objects, models together within the frame and kind of resituating and kind of reconstituting the self through photography. So, thank you.
Okay, so first, thanks to all the educators that contributed to my education to get me here today, dead and alive. Okay, so I've done that moment. I've started my start clock. And I'll jump right in. My name's Todd Gray, and I was Michael Jackson's photographer, and that's what paid for art school. And it's been a conflicting part of my past, in as much as I wanted to make sure I was not misidentified as solely Michael Jackson's photographer. So I kept my commercial practice completely separated from my art practice. And I never let anyone know that I had shot over 100 album covers and directed music videos and things like that. But that was my day job because I'm an artist. So in any event, I was in this residency, at Bellagio, the Rockefeller residency in Bellagio in Lake Como. And it's in a villa, and there's thinkers and poets and writers and a vast array of people. And the only rule at the residency is that you all come together for dinner and drinks. And that's where we exchange ideas. And I was saying I'm really uncomfortable about being here because I'm at this place where here I critique this idea of privilege, and I'm sitting at the king's table. And I thought, if this was in the 1700s when the villa came about, I certainly would not be at this table. So I'm thinking about that, and then I'm walking around the gardens, and I thought, you know what? The gardens are the actual signifier, the sign of wealth, of power, of philosophy, of logic, of aesthetics, all these things. So I chose then, because of that, and I have a couple of the fellows here who were in part of that conversation. You know who you are. And I was really happy because I came up with this idea where now what I do is I go to all, this is from Versailles, I go to all of the centers in Europe that profited and were enriched through the slave trade and through colonization of India and Africa, not that new country, India and Africa. And then I go back to those to the continent where I happen to have a studio, and the landscape. So this is Ghana, and this is Versailles, and this is called Hoods in the Garden of Eden. But Hoods in the Garden is what it's called. So, and this is a David Lewis gallery right now. It's up for a couple more weeks in Chinatown. And that's Coretta, and that's Marie Antoinette's private garden in Versailles. And I thought, oh, that's great. The king and the queen. Oh, and that's a gentleman from Akwida, Ghana, holding her portrait. And this is Francis Naminjo, who is a cultural anthropologist at the University of Cape Town, who was in those conversations at Bellagio. And he told me, interestingly, he said, here I am in Africa teaching African students about thought, and yet I can't teach them the epistemology of Africa. I can't think of them, of the history of thinking and ideas and knowledge that's African. And so we had these conversations, and it really opened up my mind, and I started reading My Life in the Bush with Ghosts, and Amos Tutula, and things like that. And so another benefit from going to this residency was just sort of thinking about non-Euclidean, non-logical structures and so forth. Hence the title of this work, Euclidean Grigri. So there's the Euclidean, which is signified by the garden, and this happens to be a garden that Leopold was responsible for. Was responsible for the genocide of over 2 million Africans in the Congo during the gathering of rubber in the late 19th century, early 18th century, so that we can have automobiles. And then there's a Ghanaian dancer and so forth, and that's from the Beat It video, and here is the cosmos, which is a really wonderful metaphor. Oh, I've got 30 seconds left. So, oh yeah, speed dating. So I like this creolization of Greek architecture, Greco-Roman architecture, and then upending this whole idea of European garden and so forth, just sort of disrupting logical structures. And one other thing I want to talk, and that's a palace in Brussels where Leopold was. And this is another a biologist, African biologist, who's at the residency. But basically, it's a question about African diaspora, about thinking in European rational ways, as opposed, I'll end it with this. You can think like this, or you can think like that.
My name is Curran Hatleberg. Before I begin, I just want to thank the Whitney for organizing this event and for having me here. It's a great honor to be here with so many artists that I deeply admire, both on the stage or down here or also in the audience. I make my work in and about America. My work is built through personal connection, exchange, and mutual collaboration. Without shared interest, vulnerability, and trust, the photographs cannot be made or even begin. I meet people by chance, and we get to know each other. Many individuals and families I get to know over months or even years. Some I only know for a few hours. It is actually somewhat rare that people say yes and invite me into their life. This is often because they have something they want to share. They too are looking for something. Steered by their personal choices, I could never guess where they might take me, who they might show me, or what they might choose to reveal of themselves. People are complex. They have the ability to be both entirely predictable and also wildly unpredictable. I remember an old woman who generously shared her house with me for a few nights. "It's dangerous out there," she warned, gesturing vaguely toward town. "You better stay here a while." She was an incredible cook and fed me like I was her son. One night, we ate spaghetti on paper plates in front of the TV. When a strong wind blasted into the room, she fired a pistol out the door into the night. I didn't even know she had a gun. She never mentioned it. One of the shots missed the open door and left a ragged hole in the wood paneling. The rain poured in. A dog somewhere began howling. Gun still raised, she rocked out of her recliner gently as if nothing had happened and closed the door against the storm. This time she made sure the latch was drawn tight. Turning to me, smiling, she warmly insisted I have a second helping of spaghetti and took my plate to the kitchen, handing me the remote on the way. In a different city, a man raised in the bayou outside of town took it upon himself to show me around. He told me he should be the mayor. He loved his city deeply. We tried planting a community garden in a vacant lot across the street from his bungalow, but the seeds wouldn't take in the poisoned ground. We found a mud-splattered dog down in a roadside ditch in a nest of swamp grass and garbage. A mama, nursing 4 pups. All their eyes were stuck shut and they shivered. We took them home and washed them in the sink, then dried them with paper towels one by one. The worried mother only bit him once. He kept her and gave the rest away. Over months, we got to know each other better, and one night he asked me to drive him somewhere, to a place he knew, not far away. On a desolate street in the darkness, he climbed over a wall with an empty sack. When he came back into view, the bag was bulging. He was running now. 2 shirtless men were on his tail, yelling after him. Panting, he hurried me to start the truck, to drive him away. The men caught up and struck the front headlight with a pipe, shattering it to pieces. Peeling out at breakneck speed, we almost ran them over. When we got home, I asked what was in the sack. Opening the bag, I saw it was filled with lemons. 100 yellow lemons, as if there could have been anything else inside. Even a great photograph is only ever a weak approximation of the vivid complexity and mystery of life. But it is exactly this that most attracts me and informs my work. Thank you.
Hi. I too am also very happy to be here with many of my friends. So in my current body of work, I use the everyday garments like my binder, which is shown here, my friends, sex, nature, to make photographs that explore surface as a way to think through my own lived experience as interpreted and ordered by my camera. I'm drawn to photography as a medium and the camera as a tool for their inherent ability to transform what is assumed to be immutable into something that can be understood anew. For me, the malleability of form in photography underscores how easily bodies can be transfigured and reimagined, not just in discursive world building, but by using the space of the world of the photograph itself. I'll talk a little bit about how these poetics kind of function in my photographs. Often they function in pairs or through juxtaposition. So for example, this image, Dick, is a picture of a hand covered in blood. To a knowing viewer, it's obviously after fisting a partner, gender not necessarily specified, nor sex. Plenty of cisgender gay men have told me that they really identify with this image because of their own personal experiences with what is depicted. The fisting that's implied here is not called fisting because the whole fist was inside the other person. The whole fist rarely is. That takes a lot of work, practice, and obliging anatomy. But the blood here acts as a kind of watermark for the point at which the hand was able to reach. The relocation of the dick to the hand is a specific kind of trans alchemy that is so specifically tied to the beauty of being able to reimagine your body. If you don't have to tie it to something, it being a concept of your body, to a physical, literal, symbolic representation, what else could that be? So for those words to be able to float around and be reassembled, that's queer world building. You build it in agreement with another person. The hand is a dick because two people have agreed to make it such via the temporary renaming and reimagining of a body part. It's important that that image that you just saw is placed next to this image, Stone Bloom, because of the way that this juxtaposition calls up a kind of kinetic potential. Stone Bloom holds a specific reference in the title to Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues. Feinberg famously rejected all potential media adaptations of her book into any kind of visual media because she wanted the characters to remain necessarily untethered to a representational identity. Once they became crystallized via, for example, a movie adaptation, she felt the text would forever be beholden to a figure, and the magic of being able to reimagine the characters based on your own experiences would be lost forever. I'm really interested in this idea. Stone Butch Blues is a monumentally important book to me in my own personal development and as part of a broader history. It's a book that has helped me understand and explain so much of how I have developed and what has happened to me, the way that your gender and sexual identity can develop as a result of and alongside sexual assault, but also simultaneously outside of it too. The ground itself here, pictured here, is in Puerto Rico, a conceptual layer that perhaps aids in the tying of this ground to my own physicality and my identity. The image has been pushed and pulled in the color akin to a kind of pushing that one would do in a darkroom, though I work digitally, making the reds from the weathered paint on this concrete surface feel more visceral and loosely bodily. I also pushed the color on the hand, making hundreds of studies of the composition. For this hand, the image actually took about an hour to make, constantly readjusting the body and also making sure that the light in the photograph would make meaning. For me, light kind of makes a kind of, light makes a kind of total obscuring of the genital area possible, so you really have no clue about the true sex of the figure, true sex being, of course, one of the things that understanding a trans person is usually all about. This attention to red and to light becomes important in the way that the two can form a kind of narrative. The fist bloody after punching the ground, the visceral futility of punching a wall, the kind of carnal force, effort, and exhaustion that comes from that, and the ground bearing the markings of a bruise. These images that I just showed you unfolded further in my work for the biennial. I was thinking about how one pushes the physicality, both the physical idea and the conceptual idea of the body, both in like my own experience and in others. The testosterone vial and the platinopalm are linked together by light and through their juxtaposition. So I'll show you the second image just now. This image right here that's upstairs. So the testosterone vial and the platinopalm are linked by light and through their juxtaposition. They form a kind of self-portrait, a version that attempts to show the experience of testosterone, of hormone therapy, not through its physical traceable changes on my body, but rather through a kind of suggestion of experience itself. The platinum, of course, is a cultural touchstone that has been a hallmark of Puerto Rican cultural production. However, it's usually always the fruit and never the leaf that you see. I'm interested in the leaf because of the duality of sex that this version of the Platino kind of offers when reimagining the body through the landscape. And kind of how those two things can come together through the formal strategy of light itself. And I'm going to end with the words of Mpagi Sepuya, the writer and the person who's pictured in this image, and what she wrote about her experience of having facial feminization surgery, which is what kind of led to the production of this picture. She kind of describes her experience about choosing facial feminization, not just as thinking about the motivation of that not necessarily being about a kind of mimetics, but rather a decision and a kind of reckoning with the body. So she says that she chose FFS not to look like a woman, but rather because she wanted to inscribe a vision of womanhood on her own body, a gash, a bleeding, a reckoning with her bones. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Wow. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for all the previous speakers. It's such an honor to be in this exhibition upstairs with everyone. It's like kind of a little bit mind-blowing. So anyways, my name's Paul. I hope everyone's doing well. I'll be quick because I'm the last speaker. I'm gonna put a timer on real quick. Okay. So I actually wanted to show a picture. This is from 2005, published in Butt magazine. It's a portrait of my friend Nick Boston. So I started making, all of my work is grounded in the production of portraiture, the complications that have arisen from that, in my own attempts to look at those friendships and relationships, the unexpected things that its production and dissemination out in the world kind of brings back. And then in the more recent work, sort of all of the reworking of all those things in my studio. Sorry for the cold. So I had been making portraits in my bedroom in Brooklyn in 2004, and they started kind of circulating on the internet. And I got an email one day from this, at the time he was a PhD student, and he asked if he could sit for a portrait and write about the experience and publish it in Butt magazine, which if anyone was around when that was like in its heyday, I was like, oh my God. But there's this thing that happens between like making work in an intimate space and an attempt to sort of understand the people around you and when it goes out into the world and sort of like what people then ask of it. So this sort of like launched a whole trajectory in I wouldn't say it was a practice back then, I was just figuring stuff out in Brooklyn. But, this is also happening at the time when we were still on Friendster, MySpace was emerging, it's pre-Facebook because I wasn't at one of those schools. So, but there was a way in which it like sort of anticipated a lot of what happens now, and the position that the photographer and the sort of like the space around the work that we create sort of produces. The next image is a picture called, from a project called Sight of a Portrait from 2009. And so another thing about it is, I was pointing my camera out at all of these people, but I became more interested in actually sort of like looking at the spaces in which I was involved in a whole sort of circle of production. So this is in a painter named T.M. Davies' studio in his home at the time in Williamsburg. And so I wanted to make an image of the making of another kind of portrait, but also me pointing the camera out is also implicating my own presence, because you can see up there that there's, a lot of people talk about like mirrors and stuff in my work now, and so this idea of actually the camera turning itself back on me has kind of been present in various ways since the beginning. And what else to say about this one? I'll just jump to the next. So this image, which is from a series called Exposures, relates to the work that's upstairs. So one of the things that I've been really interested in if people kind of take time and sort of like figure out is that most of the work on the walls upstairs is not my own, but it is made alongside the making of my own images in my studio. And that came from a comment from after a picture that was in a show in Chicago about 2 years ago where someone remarked that the photographing subject alongside me was just sort of like a model who was kind of like posing as taking a picture. And I'm like, oh no, my friend James is a photographer, and even though we're looking at my work, it's necessary that he's participating for the making of this. So there's an image upstairs by a photographer named Dicko Chan, and he's based in Los Angeles, and so you see an image of his up on the walls. This is the work that I was making at that time. So I just sort of wanted to give that sense. Whenever you see a camera in these works with a mirror, you're always looking at a camera that is making a picture. And I'm interested in sort of like the closed loop that's happening there, that we are our own audience, and there's this, it's an enclosed space and then it's sort of presented. So this is, if you go upstairs, kind of keep that in mind. And then I'm also really interested in sort of this play on the idea of the darkroom. I'd been making this work in the space behind the backdrop in my studio and in front of the mirror, and really thinking about the kind of like the sort of like formal composition of these images and sort of like a handoff of control. So on the one hand, there's the inclusion of the multiple lenses, but also this with my friend Yasser, where I'm sort of trying to steady my camera while he's kind of manipulating me in front of in this space. And then, I've got 30 seconds left, okay. And so this image, which is called Between a Mirror and a Ground, kind of sort of summarizes a lot of the things that I'm interested in currently in the studio space, that also when you're looking at my work with these images that sort of look collage-like, that it is actually happening in real physical space. And so here, this also includes not only these fragments of prior self-portraits, but also at the time, a collaboration that was in process with designer Grace Wales Bonner. We have, you see, those are my feet where I'm standing actually making the image that you're seeing. And so this kind of like collapses kind of like all of those sort of sets of associations and relationships. And I'm just gonna leave that there. Thank you. And I guess we go on to the next.
Okay, hello? So, yeah, everyone's presentations were amazing. Thank you all so much. It's such a cool group to be a part of. And I felt this way when I first saw the list for the show in general. Like I feel like because I work in photography, find myself sort of hunting around to see who the other photographers are when something like this is going up. And I thought it was a really interesting set of conversations, and it's really cool that so many of us are able to sit here and talk about it in person today. But I was asked by Megan to kind of think about trying to generate some questions or work sort of as a bit of a moderator for this group, and I'm kind of a rookie moderator, so I think we're going to have more of a conversation, but yeah, I think so where we are at this point is I think that all of us have been thinking about and dealing with the questions around the medium for quite a while, and we're just going to get a chance to talk about it some. And I think Elle and I are going to kind of help generate some questions to get that going.
Took a lot of notes.
Cool. Yeah, I was watching. That's awesome.
Yeah, use a mic. So. That is a new one. Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna privately recover from that while starting the conversation. So one of the things that kind of came up, I think, during everyone's presentations, and actually I think Lucas, you actually said these exact words, but I found them present throughout everyone's, was this idea of kind of like the re-expansion of the photograph, and maybe this idea of like re-expanding a kind of flatness, whether that flatness has to do with the physical space of the photograph or the kind of cultural history of the photograph, or even the kind of history that has been denied, and maybe photography has been a kind of part of that history of denial. And so one of the things that initially we had kind of talked about was this idea that photography had lent itself so often to projects of systemization, objectification, and control. And then even maybe thinking about, maybe for everyone here, like how your work understands these histories, and also how you conceive of perhaps its like liberatory potential from that history or in general, and if that's how you see it, because maybe it's not.
I guess I'll start. I'm on the end here. Yeah, certainly throughout the history of the medium, there are countless examples of problems. Often that has to do with like an imbalance of power or an exploitation. Those are works often based on a lack of mutuality and a kind of lack of agency on the part of those being photographed. So at least in my own case, I feel like I thought a lot about those problems and tried to bring a sense of collaborative, shared experience, connection, and a kind of deeper understanding that this was going to be a mutual effort, that we were going to come to these pictures together. And up front, there was always consent and things like that often had been left out of the history of portraying other people.
For me, there's something about the veracity of photography that I'm challenging by covering photos with other photos. And I'm wanting, in an attempt to make the viewer aware that they are making meaning, and also to make them aware that you're only seeing a small part of the representation of reality when you look at a photograph, and there's so much outside of the frame that you're not seeing. So the photographer is really controlling the context of the image. And so I want to make the viewer aware of that, and then I want to actually I create question marks instead of statements. And then it's up to the viewer to answer that question of what they're presented. And so historically, these are strategies that I got from Surrealism. I think it's strategies that come from Dada, things of that nature.
No, to kind of pick up on that, actually, I feel like one of the collapses that photography does is that there's a sense of common sense. Like there's this way that we kind of feel like we already know how to look at photographic pictures that is something that really has to be unpacked, you know? And so I think that that's one of the ways it's often served a powerful position or been, somehow tilted, is that there's a way that ideas are actually just left out of it.
Yeah, well, I want to go back to this this point that was brought up earlier by Curran, kind of thinking about this idea of portraiture and this idea of agency. And for me, in much of my practice, I try to kind of complicate the way that we can, the way in which we kind of identify, you know, who or who and how it is that we're looking. So often that kind of comes with these kind of different elements of kind of costuming, using clothes, using garments, which I think is a kind of recurring theme in a lot of our practice, is this idea of covering, concealing, withholding, but this idea of kind of this oscillation between the way in which bodies are actually presented or shown, because in the history of photography specifically, there is there's an extreme kind of power imbalance, and I hate using words specifically like objectification or exploitation, because any person working with another person is, I think, in many ways kind of engaging with that history. Something that we're all implicated in. So this idea of portraiture and staging the self, and how art history is something that has been framed, something that I try to kind of be very conscious of in kind of using when I use pictorial space, within a frame. So
I think about those conditions all the time. I mean, because portraiture is so complicated. And I have to admit that I was drawn to photography because of all of the fictions it presented, of it makes things stable. It produces a very sharp image. It tells you, I pointed my camera at this thing, I know it, right? And I attempted to do that with people, and that's what a disaster, right? So I think for me, a lot of that is really understanding that us making this work when we aim it at people is transforming the person we're aiming at the relationship in between it, and then also when these go out into the world, right? So that's one of those kind of like histories that I'm dealing with, you know, and that's how things have just become more and more just sort of like layered and fractured. But also something that I've been really interested in is latency. And that's something that I'm interested in with the mirrors as well, because I realized, you know, I've been using these mirrors, right? And they were for being able to consistently background the studio space with a sort of a changing sort of like foreground material, right? And so in order to make it not seem like a non-existent or digital space, I just stopped cleaning the mirror. One of the things that and so that you would catch these glimpses, right, of like the work of my hands or of people who came through the space, and then I realized that like that's rendered invisible against like the brightness of my studio walls, the whiteness of that space, and I started thinking about like inverting some of those priorities of photography, and so the darkroom pictures actually came around as a way of being like, how can I insert this sort of like these queer histories of like encounters and like where social relationships are formed by. I literally had to go create a dark room around my mirror in order to photograph the otherwise latent material on its surface. And I thought that was a really interesting way of dealing with that material history of photography.
I wanted to jump in really quickly because John Sarkowski pretty much made that statement asking in the 1960s when he was curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, is photography a mirror or a window? Is it something that shows your consciousness coming back to you, so it just sort of validates your narrative, or does it open up another view to something? So is it a mirror or a window? And I think about those things in the way I use roundish frames referencing mirrors, or in the way I layer it, mirror and window. And so when you said you were doing that, Sarkowski just sort of popped up into my head. Just a fun fact.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, I mean, is Sarkowski I mean, he's someone to talk about. We could talk
Just
about
like one question,
about,
just question.
Totally.
John Sarkowski.
John Sarkowski, go.
What do you want to do about that?
I don't want that modernist notion to hijack our discussion. But can I jump in about the commercial work? Because because context, when I was an undergrad and I studied with Baldessari in CalArts in the 70s, he pretty much was honing in that it's context shifts what you see. And so I thought, wow, when I studied with Alan Sekula 10 years later, he really encouraged me to go into my archive. And so here I am going into my archive of commercial photography. Picture of Chuck Berry shaking Michael Jackson's hand. A picture of a shot from a music video, from a Beat It music video. Pictures of friends, things like that. But then when you cover them and you shift the context, the narrative changes completely. And so that's what's also really interesting, how photography is not fixed and anchored. It's malleable. It's so malleable.
Do you all think about making or using an archive? Is the archive part of the project?
For me, yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think it was sort of like an unanticipated archive, but also the fact that every time you there was a space that opened up between the making of the image, going back to film days, right? Of the making of the image, processing, printing, maybe returning to it, and kind of finding that sometimes a year or two out, the picture that I initially went for was not the thing that I needed.
Yeah, definitely.
So it was always kind of oh, well, as long I have the negatives, I can always go back and change it. Who's gonna know, So that and then, I remember encountering then O'Doherty's Studio and Cube and thinking about this idea that whenever, as long as the work is within the reach of the artist, it's always open for revision and change. And so that's kind of my relationship to archive and studio. It's not making something that's fixed, but sort of saying that I may have aimed for something when I made the work, and then I can always return to it. And saying context changes everything. Work shifts as the studio shifts, as your practice shifts, as the relationships that you're dealing with in the real world shift around them, and having to kind of contend with that. So yeah, all of this stuff comes from the archive getting printed out and fragmented and reincorporated and then kind of cast off.
Elle, how about you? Do you think about it that way?
Yeah, I think as I was thinking about, I'm trying to kind of connect a thought between Paul's practice and my own, and I think one of the things that it's nice to be able to say directly to you is that, I think one of the things that your work has done for me as an artist in my own development is that it does something that, where it makes the relationships that make the work possible visible through the photograph itself, and that is part of how it, very much part of how the work functions, but also how the work is made. And I think that being self-evident in the pictures was kind of like a light bulb moment for me that I haven't necessarily maybe figured out how to incorporate in my own practice, but deeply respect of yours. And so I think a lot about the way that what I do is kind of creating an archive, and maybe in a way, although I haven't thought about this, and so I'm kind of nervous to say it out loud, but whatever. It kind of almost like some components of an. I'm shying away from the word index because it's such a loaded word.
Let's go there.
I'm like, ooh, are we gonna say it? I said it. Okay, so I think that, and in some ways not, but so many of the people that I photograph, I've had relationships with for years, and often, and especially sort of as I've kind of continued to make photographs, if I'm photographing you, it's because we're starting a relationship now. And so that, if I don't already know you, if I'm starting to photograph you now, we're kind of starting this kind of relationship. And I think that has a kind of, one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about what even to call this kind of moment in photography that I think you and I and John and many others are a part of, and Curran also is a part of, is this kind of relational photography that very much acknowledges and indexes the real-time relationships that make it possible, but also the way that it kind of respects a kind of shifting a shifting ground on those relationships, and also doesn't seek to maybe invisibilize the person within the photograph. And I think that there are a lot of decisions in how people talk about their work, and also a lot of decisions in how they make their work. And I think that for me, your work has been instrumental in maybe understanding some of my own work, and how it kind of maybe speaks to this kind of, or how I think about maybe fully fleshing out a kind of relational photography, if that's what if that's what we can call it. So yes, I do think about the archive. I'm making one.
I don't know. I think that there's the index is a funny word, because I feel like it's one as photographers that we've been kind of working on displacing for a while.
I feel like it's
and I feel like one of the more convincing descriptions of that I've come across is Kaja Silverman's replacement of index with analog or analogy. That a picture isn't really an index, it's not an objective picture of a thing in front of it, but it's much more like an analogical relationship that incorporates, both the who is viewed and who is viewing. And I don't know, I was does this maybe go somewhere to getting rid of this index language? Yes. Yeah. That's fair.
I mean, when I think of the index, 'cause all of my earlier work, I was really thinking more about literature than photography as such, because I was never satisfied with the writing that I found around photography and portraiture. So I was, there's this show up at Aperture around Orlando, Virginia Woolf, but that's one of the texts that I always went back to, particularly the way she works with genre. So it's we can deal with index, and I love that Kaja Silverman, but also with the text Orlando, she's taking a biography and reworking the sort of biography with a capital B of her father, working through this relationship, right? And so it's not actually a biography, but it includes an index, right? as if it were, but the index, because then it can no longer be you cannot then separate the index, not from some sort of like objective kind of like the discipline of official biography, but it's going to be tied to Virginia Woolf's own personal experience and relationship to Vita Sackville West. So for me, thinking of index was more about laying bare my own, like I cannot be separate from it. Like everything you see is accountable to my own intentions, to my own, like the things I was grasping for the failings. So if in a certain sense we have this index, I'm like, let's put an index there, but we have to be as vulnerable as the makers, and we can't stand behind some like, withdrawn kind of like, historical photography, anyways, that's, index it all. I'm thinking about a project of indexing all of these archives, and it's incredibly vulnerable, and I don't know where that's gonna lead to, but I hope people can speak back to it. So.
Well, there's one. Well, there's one thing that I also see that is kind of current in many of the practices. Also, is this idea of so we've talked about the index. We've talked about this this idea of commercial work or a kind of adjacent practice to the what could be understood to the art practice, but something that I think that I feel is very kind of energizing and exciting in looking at all of the work is that you really do see that the photographic medium is being kind of asserted as a kind of material and something that does have an actual great power in its moving currency and its ability to kind of speak to different audiences, to be repurposed, to be reconsidered, reinterpreted. So for me, I think very similarly to Elle and Paul, even when I make my own pictures, I'm always thinking about, especially in making pictures on negatives, is like, how do I keep track of these different kind of stories and encounters? Because in many of my pictures, at least in my earlier pictures, the pictures are really rooted in this idea of an encounter, in this way that, I think most notoriously someone like Philip Corsia, this idea that the act of making a picture is an exchange, and one thing that I've been doing recently is I've been kind of writing down specific kind of memories, attached to each picture, because for me, I think the elephant with photography is that when you're looking at it, even in real space and time, you are looking at something that is a recapture, something that photography's relationship to memory is something that is really exciting, and I think it's really exciting when I look at Paul's Instagram and I see you kind of going through your own archive of pictures that you've made when you were living in Brooklyn, and really understanding that yes, like with the kind of evolution of the relationship, the picture, it does change, and it doesn't have this kind of fixed life. So one person I really think of also in talking about this relational photography, as Elle put it, is Ariel Azoulay. She talks about the civil contract of photography and how we're all implicated in looking. No one, looking is not an active thing. It's not a passive thing. So for me, it's really exciting. to be up here and to, kind of be in conversation with you all, because, it's something that I think that we're all thinking of, is continuing to kind of activate the image. So
I want to jump in on a couple of points. One is spectacle. Photography relies on spectacle. It relies on us, the spectator. And so hence, I think that really plays well in commodity, market-driven, late capitalist culture, because it motivates us and we exist in this spectacle of images that really points us away from political realities that are just unbearable. And we are, okay, so there's that. It also relies on the spectacle of communicating a narrative that pretty much shapes people's identities, creates villains, creates heroes, creates winners and losers. It creates binaries. And life is not binary, but it sort of contributes to that. So sort of think about that on your own and gnash over it when you go to Starbucks. But what I want to do now is shift. Now that I've done, I kind of speak like my photos operate. So then what I want to do is go over to Curran, because there's genres. There's a few genres of photography that's on this panel. I'm immediately, when I remember the first seeing his work on the preview, and I thought, whoa, this is a strong documentary, he's working in that vein. And then then when I'm hearing you speak, the narrative that comes with it, you're expanding it. You're expanding it. And I was thinking, wow, maybe your work is strongest in a book format, because if I could marry it with that story, then I would start contemplating that, because of the limits that wall representation has. And I want to contextualize that with what I'm doing, because here I am, I'm a contracted photographer, hired to shoot a celebrity or what have you. And I was told when I shot MJ many times, man him up, do something, make him look more masculine, so forth and so on. And then here I am taking photographs later on of places, and I'm very cognizant of how you document a garden, how you shoot architecture, things like that, and how you use the camera so it doesn't appear to be distorting. So I'm using those ideas, but for the service of my own narrative, then I hijack them, because I want to create a narrative with it. So I'm mixing the genres, and I'm using them in a conceptual or post-conceptual way. All that to say, how are you dealing with the genre of documentary?
Yeah. Thanks for that segue. Documentary it's a tricky term. I mean, there are certain aspects and elements of that genre that I borrow from, whether that's a strict reliance on chance or a certainty that there's going to be unknowing in what's going to happen. So those are certainly elements that I borrow from documentary. I think in an odd way, I'm almost more interested in portraiture, and I feel like potentially I'm going at it from a different tack than you guys over here. But the thing that I really love is that it creates this opportunity for shared experience, where each party is open to the connection that's going to be made. Each party is opening themselves up to vulnerability and risk. And the thing that's amazing about taking a photograph of somebody, or even looking at a photograph of a person, is that it allows this opportunity for you to see yourself reflected in somebody else. And it sort of, to go back to that mirror window thing, which is it. So to me, that's one of the real gifts of portraiture, and something that I get most excited about. But classification's tricky. I mean, finding a genre that you fit neatly into, I think, is next to impossible. And oftentimes it can be problematic because it closes down creative interpretation. If you tell somebody, oh, these are documentary images, or these are commercial images, it deactivates part of the imaginative possibility of what the picture can be for a certain person looking at it.
So we wanted to.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, since the audience just came up, and since you guys have been doing amazing work up here, and that we, not to force anything, but we did want to open it up to some questions. There's a microphone, so please raise your hand. and folks will come around. There's one right there.
Thanks. Hi. I wrote the question down to be fast. You all seem to. This question is about duration and time, and/or time, which seems to be inherent in photography, but it seems like it's particularly a part of all of your work. And I'd like to shine a light on that particular idea and ask, where does time and/or duration inform your work?
Is this for everybody?
So.
All right, I guess it's twofold, right? That there's the time that the photograph is depicting, which is this precise moment when the past and the future are combining into this instantaneous present. But there's these really long swaths of time before and after the picture are made, when relationships are being built and fostered, when I'm getting to know somebody or multiple people. And so it's sort of this twofold thing where the photograph itself is compression of time, but then there's this much larger relationship that's being built around that single image.
Yeah, my time, because of archive. Who are you? Because it is from an archive, and so I'm basically mashing photographs from the 1970s together with from the 80s to 2018. And so there's film types that don't exist anymore with optics that aren't around anymore. I'm 65 years old, so there's this big span of technology, and then what I would call languages. I think the language of photography was much different when I was taking photos in during the 70s. I was really influenced by Cartier-Bresson, by oh gosh, there's a whole check, F-64 Club, all of those classic early photographers, and then, then after being completely Marxicized at CalArts, there's a whole other Marxicized and feministized, and then that all happened. So there's a hole in this representation, and there's the other shifts. So then I'm actually mixing sort of aesthetic ideologies or aesthetic tropes together on one thing, and so for me, I'm fluent with those, and I see them. That's what's sort of interesting. What I have to sort of say this: I like to make work that my mother gets. So it's really interesting. I mean, it's very important for me. And photography doesn't intimidate people, because no matter what it is, it's a photograph they could have taken it. It doesn't intimidate them, whereas a lot of art in these kind of hollowed institutions does. So, however, as broad, so I'm very generous with that, and I think most of us on this, the way we use photography, we're very generous with that. We welcome the audience. Oh yeah, Photoshop. Yeah, I know that. So, No, we're very broad. It's a very broad arm that we're using photography. But then, as you think, and as you look, and as you consider, and as you ponder, then the nuances start revealing, and then the conversations, if you are curious, start unfolding, and that's what's really, really important.
Time.
Yeah. So time. I don't know. I haven't thought as much about time as I have about space, but I do think that at least in one aspect, like there is the sense of like the photograph being a time stop or like an instant that is then kind of like piled on top of in my work, oftentimes with these other kind of gestural time or like sort of post-production times that are all really evident at the same juncture. So it's like sometimes they're kind of antagonistic, but I think that, time is, you.
Actually, so well, all of us teach, and so one of the distinct pleasures of being a teacher right now is getting to teach the work of actually everybody on this panel. And so when I introduce students to your work, Lucas, like frequently the thing that they are most shaken by is the fact that you actually unbind the photograph from, I think, how they think about time and like how they, like the ways that they've come to understand like the logic of not only photography, but the way that the camera works, the way that the whole kind of enterprise of photography works, and what becomes like positively disturbing for them is the way that you just kind of like chuck it. And like one thing that actually one student wrote once was that no one person should have this much power.
That's amazing.
In relationship to just being able to like unbind the photograph from reality. It's like all gravity has left the room. So I think that that's something that's like, when I think about your work, I think about that kind of like, that rug being kind of pulled out from underneath, and every expectation of how a photograph does interact with the world and interact with time is like unbound by the pictures. And I think for myself, I think my relationship to time is very similar to Curran's, and in that there is the kind of moment that the picture is made, and then there's all of the moments outside of it that made it possible, which is also how it feels related to Paul's work and many others as well. And so I think that like often for me, like I've thought a lot about what makes it time to kind of like make a photograph, and like the what needs to happen in terms of a relationship with a person in order to make that picture. And sometimes it's immediate and sometimes it's years. There have been photographs that I've waited 7 years to make, and there are photographs that have been made multiple years in between. And Maisie, who I photographed, who I showed a picture of, was actually, I photographed her for the first time in 2014, and then coming back around for this image, photographing her again. It's almost like that. This picture for me could only be possible with the experience of the photograph in 2014 being made, the afterlife of that image, the way that that kind of like underscored or existed within our relationship, how she saw me kind of like deal with that image, how she saw that kind of image play out in time, and then agreeing to make this photograph and having some kind of relationship to trust, both like her trust of me really, to be able to kind of make this picture, and then that responsibility allows me to be able to make this picture of her at a very vulnerable moment where she's actually in quite a lot of pain in about 30 minutes. And so that kind of, the picture takes 30 minutes, and it also takes like 5 years. And so that kind of is sort of how I've been kind of dealing with it.
But that particular picture also jumps back about
Sure.
600-800 years.
Sure.
Catholicism, sainting.
Yes.
I mean, it's
Very much so. Yes, and that also, that too.
Me?
I think John's passing.
Okay. Okay. Time. So, like talking about looking at my Instagram and like posting like, I drove cross country with like boxes of prints that had like never seen the light of day, and so like I go through them, and it's like I look at these pictures and I'm like, oh my God, like this is from 15 years ago where we're like babies, we were just like becoming friends, and now, I never expected that a lot of the people in that early work would be my closest friends, and they would still be part of this. So there's just the time of like aging and growing together, and like you said, some pictures take 5 years, 10 years to make, but also there's like the time that I think is like the studio time for me, which is where everything is like in the present. I think of it as more just like a language of like tenses. I actually taught going back to Cal Arts. I taught a class at Cal Arts called Tenses, and it's like I think thinking in time in that way. It's like it's how you use it. Like how are we conjugating these? Like can we think about images in the way we think about language? And there's sort of like no limit to that, right? It's like some languages have fewer, some have more tenses. But then with the current work, since about 2014 and on, since it's been digital capture, before that I was shooting on film, actually hidden in all of the work is the entire sequence in which it was made. So if you notice in my pictures, they are all appended with like a parentheses and then a number. That's the file number that the camera assigns to them. And so you could actually, so there's a lot about like, there was what I did a show at the Team Gallery Bungalow in LA a couple years ago. Someone like came to the gallery, like they emailed me and they're like, oh my God, this person like went to the show and then like lined up everything and like figured out the order in which you made the work. And I was like, this is a amazing and also terrifying. But I was like really happy for that because, I mean, the thing is, there's like, for me with that, it was about the gaps in time. There's a lot of failure. There's a lot of things that you don't see. So that's another way in which I'm thinking about time. I would never ever like conceive of a show where I would just like put it in order. It wouldn't make sense because I don't work that way. But there is an encoding of time in the pictures.
Hi, thanks. You talked a lot about relationships between your subjects, between each other, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little, if any of you are interested in the relationship. I mean, you've talked a lot about relationships with audience, but especially with people holding up their own phones, taking pictures of your pictures and the way they share them out into the world. If you could just talk a little bit about the relationship to the audience and the audience's relationship with your work.
Yeah, I think, Paul, actually, you said something really beautiful during your presentation, which had to do kind of exactly with what you're asking, which is like the photographs being made within an intimate space, and then versus what happens when that goes out into the world. And I think I'm also, especially Curran, in your presentation, how you described like that kind of just every moment, like those moments, right? And like what that felt like and the kind of openness that they require, and then also the kind of like the way that the like experience undoes the myth, but then like the photograph remaking a myth and like how that kind of exists in the world too. Yeah, that's a great question.
It's been interesting to watch that happen, where people are taking the photographs and then proliferating them out into the world. I love that, you know, within photography, we're all subjective parties, where we're making the photograph, and it's only ever going to be this partial record of something that actually happened. And then the viewers bring their own subjectivity to it as well, so that between those two subjectivities, something new is being created in that space. So I don't know what happens when it gets onto Instagram or further than that, or what happens, but I imagine that it just keeps going in a certain way. Yeah, I don't know.
I think of Walter Benjamin and what is it? Reproducible art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Art in the age of mechanical reproduction.
Yep.
And the idea of photography and the aura. You know, once you had a painting, the only way to experience that painting was to go to the place, go to that cathedral, so forth, to see that piece. Then with the advent of photography, you don't have to go there anymore. You can see the picture, but then you don't get the aura. You don't get the whole idea of traveling, of going, and so forth, which is part of the experience, the experience to travel to that space. So I think similarly, when I've seen images that I've done here, the experience of seeing my work, because it's sculpture that uses photography, and so hence it's 3D, and I'm playing with, and I'm challenging the two dimensions and the wall art and so forth, and it actually has depth. And when you shift and when you moved, some things are covered, some things are revealed. But you don't get that when it is on Instagram and so forth and so on. And so that always makes me scratch my head and think about the aura, because Benjamin said that photography was going to democratize everything, because it would certainly, nothing can be unique anymore, because a photograph is infinitely reproducible. But of course, the Museum of Modern Art stepped in, and additions and so forth, and go read your photo history.
Back to Sarkowski.
Yeah, back to Sarkowski.
It's all come full circle.
Yeah, I think the phone's really weird. I mean, I made I'm not on Instagram, but I also this work that's for the billboard has like a component that you can only see through your phone, you know? So I have a really ambivalent relationship to these things. I feel like...
Wait, a component you can only see through
yeah,
your
so there's
phone?
an augmented reality, there's an app for this piece that makes it do all sorts of sculptural things. But I think that that there is something, like I think there's something amazing about photography's ability to be the thing on the wall and the thing in the book and the thing online. Like there's something about this shape-shifting quality that's kind of incredible. And I think one of the reasons I've really stayed working sort of strictly within the medium has been because of this. Like, I'm really interested that it can travel at these really different speeds. I don't know. I mean, I was like, this is the second augmented reality project I've made. And the first one I made, I felt, when I started off, I felt really ambivalent about this, about this whole way. But I think that after having the first experience, doing it again in a different situation, in a different way, it kind of felt like maybe a way to activate that activity a little bit and make it a little more conscious. So I don't really know. It's still, ambivalence. That's what you got. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I also feel as though this kind of relationship that photography has to being able to be latent and present in so many different ways, shapes, and forms is something that's really exciting to me about it as a medium. And, for me, especially in thinking about, this idea of audience or that, that they're like that pictures, again, like speaking to what you were speaking about earlier, Paul, about how, there are photographs that are made in private, or, perhaps pictures that were made that maybe were not made for the intention of being widely circulated. I think that is something that is potentially like kind of troubling to me, but it's also kind of really exciting at the same time. So it's kind of like that kind of push and pull between kind of private making and public consumption. That is very, very, to me, exciting about photography, because it's going back to thinking about how photography in itself, is a language. It's its own kind of language, and there have been kind of systems kind of created around it, but in many ways it never, photography is just so much smarter than us in a way. So it never kind of obeys or stays within kind of one confine. And I think that that's what's really exciting about it, and that it is something that somewhat, anyone does have access to. So then it becomes, for me, about how do I create my own language, through my pictures. So
It's funny, we think of photography as being fixed, but you're right, it's polymorphous. It's shifting in shape all the time, and once it goes on the gram, depending on who is posting it, then it sort of also depends, then they become the author, and they supply the context because who posted it. And so it's just moving all the time, so it's context, context, context. I get a little annoyed because there's a real socio-political critique in my work. Once it's out, the critique is flattened. Hopefully someone's interested enough to do a little research.
But also on that, like, photography's smarter than us, or the ways that we can anticipate. I mean, like, most of the subjects of my work are gay men, and gay men are really cheap. So like the work gets used in ways like, years ago they would my work would end up on people's Manhunt profiles. And like, I'm like totally down with that. And now it like circulates on Grindr and Scruff, and I love it. And like, I actually really, so anyways.
Wait, so I can get your work and
another,
start doing
yes. So another thing of like, what Benjamin could not have anticipated, but I think, when I do talks, I usually show like this photograph, like this Truman Capote self-portrait from '48. That's like a part of my like standard artist talk, because like he really knew exactly how the reproduction and dissemination of this picture on this dust jacket would totally scandalize and seduce and like bring stuff back to him. So it's like, yeah, it gets used like that. So in a certain way, I'm anticipating an audience. Like it was made very clear. But also in the current work, I'm really interested in like not caring about the audience at all. I used to title all of the work, every portrait was titled by the name of the person. So it kind of like gave a little something if you didn't know who it was, right? But now there's no names. And particularly with the mirror works, I'm really interested in the fact that like, you're kind of like, oh, it's nice you kind of get a peek into the space, but like in the making of the work, the whole loop of like production and viewing is already sealed off. And then I'm really interested in ideas of recognition, which is I think also something that plays a part in like in your work in the obscuring of the figures, but also in ours, I think in terms of like social spaces, right? It's like I look at John's work and I know the people in it. I look at your work, I know some of the people in it. And I'm really interested in that space of like really putting the viewer on the side of like, do you know? Like you're like, great, come to the show, but like, how close are you to us? Do you know everyone? Do you not? And are you comfortable in not knowing? So that's something that I'm really into now. Because particularly like the language of like concealing and revealing is talked about a lot, but I'm really interested in the fact that like intimacy, like concealing is only concealing depending on how close and intimate you are to that person. So like I'm interested in like a glimpse of maybe someone's, like a fragment of a tattoo or like a piece of something that's like recognizable about someone, and then you know. So anyways, that's.
Yeah, one of the things that and to kind of maybe close it out on Instagram, one of the things that I have been kind of really interested in by and also really in love with lately is how much Instagram kind of undoes the idea of the silent subject, and how Instagram, maybe very specifically, has been a place where people will speak very directly about the photograph that they are in themselves. And so that, for example, is where I pulled the language from Mpagi Sepuya and like what she wrote about her picture. And she wrote this kind of beautiful paragraph about having been photographed. And our friend Becky, who's in this photograph by John also recently, wrote about her experience being photographed by you as well. And so I think one of the things that Instagram has done is kind of really kind of force a reckoning of photographer and person who is being depicted, and in a way kind of eliminate any possibility for that silence to exist. And I think that that's really something that has shifted in like the decade since Instagram has been introduced to us as a tool and as a platform and as a cultural experience. And I think that that's one of the kind of, I mean, I'm not like trying to be dramatic. I don't want to call it like a crisis, but like it's something that's like, it's really sort of invited a kind of it has invited a kind of crisis into photography in having to like reimagine the bounds and rights and responsibilities of authorship, of authoring the image, and then having that image be able to not just exist as a static object, but rather be this kind of thing that has that is a living document. I don't know, a living image in the world, and that authorship is not now seen as monodirectional, but rather as really kind of like multi-parted authorship of that image, and how I'm very curious as to how that is going to continue to change, and how at the point at which we have enough distance to kind of trace that change too, because I think it's really kind of happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because we can be as careful and considerate and like in the making of the image, but our responsibility doesn't end there. It's like there's like an ongoing responsibility of care and ethics with how we put the images out into the world. And like, I mean, I have this show up in St. Louis, and I had like the individual portraits, I'd kind of like told people like, it's gonna be up there. But there's like an image in there that's like a photograph of pictures on my studio wall from 2013 or something like that. And in this image, nested within another image, is like a friend on like and it's in that picture, it's the only set of eyes looking out at you, right? And so it was like the day of the press preview or something, and a guy who works at the education department was at the front desk, and he's like, oh my God. So I posted this picture from the gallery on Instagram, and then someone tagged your friend
Yes.
Danny in it,
Yes.
and then he was like, I hope I didn't do something wrong, and I was like, oh, my first thought was like, oh shit, I forgot to tell him he's present on the wall. I was like, oh my God, it wasn't anything. And then I like reached out, and I was like, oh yeah, and I'll let him, I'm gonna, send him more info. But I was like, oh my God, like I try to be careful in the making of the work, but in many ways, you just like, gaps open up, and that's gonna continue to happen. That will continue to happen, but like just being honest, like, Instagram made that happen.
Yeah,
and now it's suddenly people in like a totally different part of the country. I did not anticipate that picture would ever leave Brooklyn, probably, Now it's like people in St. Louis like know who he is and like can now search his profile. Sometimes people want that, sometimes people don't. Anyways.
Since we have talked about time, I'm just gonna say you guys all did an amazing, amazing job with the keeping to time. But I think thank you all for your attention. Thank you all for these incredible thoughts. I hope the conversation will continue, possibly on Instagram. Thank you.